Abbott government, asylum seekers, and truth. Welcome to Media Watch. Tonight we are bringing you a special investigation into the issues of refugees reported in the media and whether that media portrayal of the refugees' experience was accurate. Is Scott Morrison not telling you the full story on asylum seekers' arrivals? Immigration Minister Scott Morrison says the Coalition's border protection policy has resulted in an 80% reduction in asylum seekers arriving in Australia by boat. Recently, Morrison said, quote, "In the previous government, after the announcement of the regional resettlement arrangement, an average of 461 people, not including crew, were turning up on just over 6 boats every week. Since the commencement of the Operation Sovereign Borders, this has fallen by more than 80%, just to 78 people illegally arriving per week, on less than 2 boats, not including crew." Mr. Morrison and other Liberal MPs have been repeating these figures over the past few weeks, saying the reduction is a result of, quote, "our efforts under Operation Sovereign Borders." Labor, however, disagrees on ABC's Q&A program on November 25th. Opposition Treasury spokesman Chris Bowen repeatedly said Mr. Morrison's figures were just not right. The ABC has collated data on asylum seekers' boat arrivals from July 19, where former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd announced his regional resettlement arrangement with Papua New Guinea, to November 29, when Mr. Morrison made his claim. The essence of Mr. Rudd's announcement was that no more asylum seekers arriving in Australia by boat would be settled in Australia.
Go.
In the period before Operation Sovereign Borders began, July 19 to September 17, 3,753 asylum seekers arrived on 55 boats. In the period since September 18 to November 29, 751 asylum seekers have arrived on 15 boats. ABC's fact check calculates an average of 431 asylum seekers were arriving on average of 6 boats per week in the earlier period. In contrast, an average of 72 people were arriving on less than 2 boats per week in the later period. Based on this comparison, Mr. Morrison's claim checks out. There was an 80% reduction in asylum seekers during this period. However, it is important to note that data shows a clear and consistent tapering off from late July, which continued to the election. The ABC consulted 2 researchers from the University of Queensland who specialise in data analysis, Dr. Angela Higginson and Jason Ferris. They modelled the data and concluded that, quote, "there has been a statistically significant reduction in the number of arrivals since the Coalition took government, but it sits as part of a trend in reduction of arrival that began with the last government." So in short, Mr. Morrison is right, but he's not taking the context into account. The researchers say that comparison period of before and after Operation Sovereign Borders used by Morrison misses the point, quote, "because this trend began back in July and there is no sign that the election of Abbott coalition government has had any impact on arrivals whatsoever," unquote. The claim. Scott Morrison says the Coalition's border protection policy has resulted in an 80% reduction in asylum seekers in Australia arriving by boat. The verdict. There has been an 80% reduction in asylum seekers arriving in Australia by boat in comparison period outlined by Mr. Morrison. However, the data shows the number of arrivals began to slow significantly under Labor soon after Mr. Rudd's regional settlement arrangement was announced. Mr. Morrison's claim is correct, but there is more to the story. Footage obtained by the ABC shows several asylum seekers who Indonesian police say were on a vessel forced back by the Australian Navy on January 6, 2014, being medically assessed for burns on their hands. The asylum seekers claim they were burnt and kicked when the Australian Navy forced them to touch part of the boat engine. The government has denied the allegations and defended the professionalism of the Navy, with Mr. Abbott asking the question,
What do you believe? Do you believe Australian naval personnel or do you believe people who are attempting to break Australian law? I trust Australia's naval personnel.
Last year, the ABC examined the legal position of asylum seekers arriving in Australia. Immigration Minister Scott Morrison was found to be correct when he described people who come without a valid visa as having illegally entered Australia. However, these people do not break any law. While Mr. Morrison used correct terminology, Mr. Abbott may have overstepped the mark. Media Watch contacted the Prime Minister's office to clarify whether his comment related to asylum seekers or crew members. People smuggling is a criminal offence under Australian law. No response has yet been received. It is therefore necessary to analyse the context of the remarks. It is clear from the exchange during his press conference that Mr. Abbott was referring to asylum seekers seeking to enter Australia by boat without a valid visa. Fact Check also asked the Prime Minister's office what law he says that these people were attempting to break. In the absence of any clarification or suggestion of any unrelated criminal acts by the asylum seekers, we at Media Watch take him to mean that the people were attempting to break Australian migration law. Entry into Australia is governed by the Commonwealth Migration Act of 1958. While it is accurate to describe asylum seekers who enter Australia without a valid visa, unlawful or even illegal entrance, it is not a criminal offence to enter Australia without a visa. Calling someone unlawful or an illegal entrant is a description of how they entered the country and determines the way authorities process them. It does not mean they have broken any law. Arriving without a visa can only result in criminal sanctions if there is some other offence involved, such as falsifying a passport or forging a document. An asylum seeker who is simply a passenger on people smuggling vessels does not commit an offence and by paying people smugglers for their passage. In relation to Mr. Abbott's comments, immigration law expert Professor Andreas Schloenhardt of the University of Queensland told Fact Check, quote, "Breaking the law is generally understood to mean committing a criminal offence. Persons arriving in Australia irregularly, especially asylum seekers, do not do that," unquote. Professor Schloenhardt suggests that the more accurate description would have been, quote, "persons seeking to enter with complying with administrative rules relating to immigration," unquote. The claim. Tony Abbott says asylum seekers who come to Australia are attempting to break Australian law. The verdict. Mr. Abbott is incorrect when he says that the asylum seekers making allegations against the Royal Australian Navy were attempting to break Australian law. Australia recognises people's right to seek asylum, and entering Australia without a valid visa is not a criminal offence. Now let's explore the experience of refugees from the Vietnam War compared to the refugees of today. Here's reporter Tirth Shah with his story.
The Fraser government was unprepared for the unexpected spike of Vietnamese refugees, which resulted in the government allowing the migration of thousands of Vietnamese refugees into Australia. Mr. Fraser had no solutions but to let the Vietnamese refugees into Australia. This was presented by the media as that Vietnamese refugees were welcomed with open arms. However, this idea was soon transformed. Initially, the Fraser government only resettled a small number of Vietnamese refugees. By the end of 1997, 2.5 years after the end of the Vietnam War, 2,553 refugees and 979 boat people had been resettled. Nevertheless, in the early 80s, the government became increasingly suspicious of the Vietnamese asylum seekers. In parliamentary debates, Vietnamese boat people were portrayed as duplicitous economic migrants wanting to circumvent immigration laws to secure a better way of life. This means that sooner or later, the Australian government decided that letting all these people in for free isn't just going to cut it. Furthermore, welcoming refugees with open arms caused more problems rather than solving them. Immigration Minister Ian McPhee warned the House of Representatives that, quote, "a boatload of illegal immigrants," unquote, was approaching Australia under the guise of refugees fleeing Vietnam. And McPhee concluded that, quote, "that a proportion of people now leaving their homelands were doing so to seek a better way of life rather than to escape from some form of persecution," unquote. He argued that to accept these boat people as refugees would, quote, "in effect allowing queue jumping," unquote.